Right, Star Wars Jedi Survivor on the PS5 Pro. Are game companies a little bit obsessed with ray tracing all the time? Are Respawn completely useless? And are Digital Foundry ever so slightly biased towards PC? Let's take a look.
Star Wars Jedi Survivor is a game we have a long history here with at Digital Foundry. It has been patched, and patched again, and finally it is now being patched with PlayStation 5 Pro support. Does this fix some of the game's issues on the base PlayStation 5? Well, let's find out. And to join me talking about this infamous game here today, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Oliver McKenzie. How you doing there, Oliver?
Yes, I'm well, Alex. Another piece of ore from the PS5 Pro mines, but I think this is a pretty rich vein potentially.
Oh my goodness!
To chat about today. Yes,
I could see that all in my head. That metaphor, it was beautiful. But yes, here we're talking about the additions and the changes in the various modes that are brought on with the PlayStation 5 Pro patch for this game. A game which has seen a large evolution ever since it launched in a rather disastrous state on all platforms.
Rather disastrous state is an understatement. Companies have a habit these days of chucking out games just 3/4 broken and then fixing them as they go along as people find the flaws for them. It's a pretty lazy way of playtesting, but it is the way things are, unfortunately.
Large evolution ever since it launched in a rather disastrous state on all platforms. A lot of evolution there, getting performance up and whatnot, but today we're going to see what it's been adding here on the PlayStation 5 Pro. Oliver, could you give us the lay of the lands and the modes here, what they're like?
Yeah, so basically we have two modes here. We have a performance mode and a quality mode. And I think we should probably start with that performance mode on PS5 Pro.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, because I think that's where we see the most interesting updates here.
Alex cannot look any more unenthusiastic about this. He must be so sick of this game. It's just incredible. Funny.
And potentially also some of the more substantial issues, but I won't spoil that just yet. If you read the settings in the menu here, it describes this mode as having partial ray tracing enabled. Now this is interesting because originally Jedi Survivor had RTGI and RT reflections in both performance and quality modes on PS5 and Series X, but they removed it in the performance modes in a patch last September. And that was very successful. It got the game to just about a locked 60 FPS with better image quality, better internal resolutions. So
just pausing briefly, and that is what people want. People want better frame rates, more stable image quality, not fancy effects everywhere, which add very little difference. I mean, that's like looking at the floor trying to find the extra effects. And of course, you can see a slightly extra effect on the right-hand side image, but it's not much, not at the cost of those frame rates and a stable image and things like that. It's not what people want.
Got the game to just about a locked 60 FPS with better image quality, better internal resolutions. So here it seems like they've brought at least some of that back. So I did some comparison shots here to work out exactly what's changed between PS5 Pro and the old performance mode. Good. So right off the bat, it does seem like PS5 Pro gets RT reflections. These can be subtle, but if you look at the floor in this shot, you see more reflective detail on Pro. I find that the RT reflections tend to be a bit more prominent in outdoor sequences, though, where they reflect a rough approximation.
I mean, that does look nice on a still shot. Those ray traced reflections on the right-hand side image does look a lot nicer than the one on the left. But if it starts moving and it falls to pieces, I'd rather have the lack of ray tracing and a decent performance.
I find that the RT reflections tend to be a bit more prominent in outdoor sequences, though, where they reflect a rough approximation of the environment as a perspective, correct, and decent-looking fallback for the SSR they otherwise have. So kind of like lumen reflections here. It's not the most detailed RT reflections in the world, but it does serve a useful purpose in this title, I would say. But one thing you'll notice is that if you compare the performance mode and the old quality mode, the RT reflections sometimes appear more limited. There's less geometry in them. They aren't really properly lit sometimes.
No, it looks bad.
This was more of an issue in the first level. In the second level, they look about the same as in the quality mode, which makes sense because in the first level, it is a very intensive level in terms of how demanding it is on the game. So I can imagine they might need to lighten it up a bit there. For the RTGI, it's a bit harder to tell sometimes because the difference between RTGI on and off, a little bit subtle in this game sometimes. The baked approximation of the RTGI is very good, and the RTGI appears to be probe-based, so it's not a per-pixel RTGI that might provide a lot of detail, especially up close. It's a little bit more coarse than that.
Right.
But if you do some comparisons here, the PS5 Pro in the performance mode, it's clearly not resolving the same kind of lighting detail as the old quality mode here. And there are some tells that we've worked out for RTGI in this game. Like in these shots, I'm running forward and backwards, and that lighting detail, it's popping in the quality mode, not popping in the performance mode. That's kind of a tell that we're dealing with some kind of real-time RTGI system there. Also, when we swap between performance and quality mode, the lighting takes some time to kind of rebuild and propagate a little bit across the environment, presumably because we're switching between RTGI and a baked GI solution there. This is the exact same behavior that we saw on PS5 as of last September's patch, but critically, in the patches before last September, we did not have this behavior because they were not switching between the baked GI and RTGI.
Right.
There is one last detail here, and this is something that has come up that's a little bit odd, which is that if you read the press release for these new modes, they describe the performance mode as including ray-traced occlusion and reflections here. So I did note the performance mode before had some very thick SSAO around the foliage. And so I think possibly what might be going on here is that the new performance mode includes RTAO. And when we turn on RT...
Yeah, it's doing that shimmering thing, which doesn't look very, very nice. And it is quite noticeable in games as well. It's not like you have to pause it all the time and have a look for that kind of thing. It is actually quite noticeable sometimes. Not all the times, but...
includes RTAO. And when we turn on RT on the PC version, we see similar foliage lighting as well as this new performance mode. So As well as this new performance mode. So I kind of suspect that maybe this title possibly it always had RTAO. Unfortunately, they never ever told us exactly what was going on with the RT in this title, so it was kind of up to us to determine. So how are we supposed to differentiate between, like, you're adding RTGI, adding RTAO? This is a hard thing to do, but possibly these are separate effects. I just don't know, but possibly, or maybe something else is going on. I don't know.
Yeah,
that's just my impression from what's been said so far.
Yeah, based upon what you're saying, though, it kind of makes sense. I was a little bit confused when they mentioned the RTAO thing too, because back when we were doing the initial launch coverage of this game, we had to figure out exactly what was going on. And there wasn't really the usual good evidence of like some very strong difference in AO other than the foliage looking different between the modes. Mm-hmm. And there it was, you could have chalked it up to almost anything. So it could have RTAO like they describe it as, and the treatment though is very light. Okay, so they've changed that up, but have they also introduced things like PSSR? What's that image quality like in the performance mode?
Yeah, they have. It's interesting. First of all, the other visual settings outside of the ray tracing do appear to be the same as before. You have similar foliage draw, similar shadows, but the real key change here, outside of the RT, is the addition of PSSR in this title. Because they have added PSSR in this game, in the performance mode, and image quality, unfortunately, it's really not good with PSSR in this title. If you look at this side by side, for instance, you can see just how unstable the game appears now with PSSR in the performance mode. I would personally go as far as to say it looks dramatically worse than the old performance mode here. Which
see, why are companies doing this? Just because a console has a feature, it doesn't mean you have to use it as much as you can, just so you can say, oh look, we used PSSR in this example. Like, if it's not working in that title, or you don't know how to use it properly, then don't use it. It's like, crikey. I mean, it's not that PSSR is bad. It's just that, like, Respawn are a little bit useless. Like, Ratchet & Clank, Rift Apart, The Last of Us Part 2 have proved beyond doubt that PSSR is very good. It's excellent when used properly. But it doesn't mean say you have to try and use it in every single title. If the PS5 performance mode looks better then the PS5 Pro Performance mode, the developer is doing something wrong. And it's not the fault of the console, it's just lousy developing.
I would personally go as far as to say it looks dramatically worse than the old performance mode here, which after the patch last September with FSR was not that offensive looking. It was not too bad. It was basically okay, especially from a normal viewing distance on a large format television. It's just super unstable. It sort of reminds me of like XeSS with more heavy upscale factors, where there's a kind of low-level instability to the image with kind of machine learning-based upscale artifacts everywhere. Some things also look a little bit buggy, like the way that PSSR can render foliage here. It's very unstable, and the lighting on the foliage can kind of pulse in and out in a really distracting manner, which is weird. They can kind of get really dark and then really light again.
I mean, how does this not get picked up when they're testing things, or just during the procedure of making the game? It's so obvious. How can they not see that? Or do they just not care to the degree where they just release it anyway and say, hey, there it is, like it or lump it, that's how it's going to be. It's just absolutely terrible.
It just looks bizarre. But it is worth noting that I did spot that same issue on PC with DLSS, but it was a much lesser issue there. So that's something that does pop up.
Sort of agree with that, but he's being very kind to the PC there. I've got a friend who has this game, and I will say it's not as bad as what they're showing right now on the performance mode of the PS5 Pro, but it's not a million miles away, and it's certainly not as faint as what they're showing it there in their example on the right hand side. It's somewhere kind of in between, so it's not like the PC version is exactly as perfect as they're making out either. It should be better on the PC anyway, because they're on DLSS 3.0, is it now? But this is the very early iteration of PSSR in its first, like, literally a few weeks of being launched. I mean, the first version of DLSS was really bad. It was artifacty, it was blurry, it wasn't good at all. So this is still not a very good example of PSSR though, so I'm not, defending it or anything like that. It's still a bad example.
To be fair, in artificial environments like the first level, the results are better. It's still got more aliasing and more breakup and more temporal instability than FSR2 did before. But it's not a night and day deficit. It's substantial, but it's not gigantic. Yeah. One advantage, though, is that on PS5 Pro, the image can look a little bit sharper and a bit more detailed in motion. Like if I show you some still frames here, the image with FSR in motion, it's a bit softer. And for sure, when it doesn't have a nice stationary shot to accumulate a nice high-resolution image, it does not look as sharp. But in still shots, it does look sharper than the PSSR shot, because the PSSR shot is just super noisy and actually kind of not super high detail there. In terms of the resolution numbers, I think PSSR is upsampling to 1800p, while the old performance mode is going to 1440p, which is partially based on the description in the settings menu and in EA's PR on this game,
right,
which says they're upscaling to 1800p, but it's not resolving 1800p worth of detail. Now, EA says it's upscaling from 1200p to 1800p. Unfortunately, in my testing, that was not the case. It's actually about 900p on average, but there is some pretty severe...
EA making things up. Who would have thought that was such a thing?
Testing, that was not the case. It's actually about 900p on average, but there is some pretty severe dynamic resolution scaling. So the lowest number I got was below 720p. The highest number I got was well above 1080p. Yeah. So it's very variable.
That is very variable. And it's also, I mean... we've seen with like ultra performance mode for FSR or DLSS on PC that getting something like 720p to look 4K like is already a huge challenge, but getting sub 720p to look 1800p like is arguably even more of a challenge because...
Right, I'm just going to butt in there quick, because the point of these AI learning things like DLSS, like PSSR, is you can make a game with a lower resolution and allow PSSR or DLSS or whatever to upscale it to look like it's a higher resolution, which reduces workload off the main processor or the overall power of whatever you're playing it on. And that should enable you to then to run the game at a higher frame rate. That is kind of the idea. But some companies like Respawn are just managing to make an absolute mess of it.
Even more of a challenge because like as soon as you go sub 720p, you're in like Xbox 360 territory for like even the not good games on Xbox 360 necessarily. So, yeah, wow, that's intense. Hearing you talk about the image quality issues that you're seeing there does remind me a little bit of our discussions on Alan Wake 2 about just like a general instability in still images, like kind of noise and less precision there, as well as the issue that you described with foliage, where the AO or the lighting or the foliage themselves is like pulsing, getting darker and lighter rapidly. Does remind me of some of the issues we saw in Alan Wake 2 with regards to the volumetric lighting, and somewhat a little bit the AO when you'd like walk along the ground. I made a shot of that in my video, but I didn't call it out correctly.
I'd also say here with PSSR, I did some pixel counts, which I'll show you right now. And actually with PSSR, it's almost identical across the 4 shots I tested to the old version with FSR2 and on PS5. But it is one shot counted at a higher resolution, but in general, it's about the same. And then in terms of one last thing in the performance mode, in terms of the frame rates in that mode, it is basically a flawless 60 FPS in the content that I tested. Did drop a couple frames from time to time, like on this river, and it is accompanied by a little bit of screen tearing in the top portion of the screen, but it's generally 60 FPS. I did check this area on PS5 and it actually does hold a locked 60 FPS, but there are no RT reflections obviously on PS5, so it's not exactly a fair comparison in this scene with a ton of RT reflections.
There's certain parts of the game
I even tried the infamous Kobo run, which we have not actually included in our console testing of this game so far. But as far as I can tell, it's a faultless 60 FPS, which is a little bit strange based on our experiences on PC. It's also a little bit unusual because typically UE4 traversal stutter does extend very often to consoles there.
Mm-hmm. But saying that, it's still not acceptable that only certain parts of the game play okay. Just making that clear, because it's not when they cost a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. I've played a bit of this game on PC for this piece, and even on my 13700K 4090 system, it stutters like crazy, especially with the art on it. It's just a total mess.
Well, that's good. So at least admitting, even on his PC, which will be a pretty good one, that the game falls apart even on that. So it's not quite, it sounds like it was just digging at the PS5 Pro, and it kind of is, because it's, a new console. Everyone likes to try and bash it sometimes. Don't know why. It's one of them things. But the PC has similar issues.
Yeah, especially with the art on it. It's just a total mess. So it's a lot better here.
Yeah, it is a lot better.
So that part's actually better on the PS5 Pro version than his powerful PC version. Interesting. But probably the opposite is true on other parts of the game. It's just, this game seems completely messed, to be honest.
Hard to know exactly where that comes from. This game, based upon this patch right here, a little bit messy at times in its development. But it's interesting that you described the internal resolutions counting to be so similar, excluding that one shot there. And I think that is actually, it does make a little bit of sense, because if they're spending extra GPU horsepower on PSSR, which is going to be invariably more expensive than FSR, and then if they also spend it on things like increased ray tracing, which is very GPU expensive, then it's going to eat up most of the chance to increase resolution, which could actually be one of the downsides to image quality here. There's not enough, maybe it needs more input resolution occasionally. But yeah, that's pretty interesting. Okay, so performance mode doesn't sound too hot, minus the performance, which seems okay enough. But what about quality mode? What is that like?
Yeah, so here, I'll go through this a bit quicker because it's a bit more straightforward and we're touching on some of the same themes. The RT reflections and RTGI, possibly RTAO, who knows? They're about the same as they were before. You get more lighting detail relative to the performance mode, both the old performance mode and the new performance mode, but with some more kind of lighting pop in with that RTGI as a trade-off. It's not kind of super gentle. It is popping in a little bit. You are seeing those chunks of lighting detail pop in. One thing I did note, though, when I was switching between modes here, sometimes the RTGI didn't propagate properly. So you're left with missing lighting detail like black holes in the image here. Or in this image, I'm switching between the modes in this spaceship, and the whole roof is just black. It's totally blacked out. So it doesn't look quite correct. But a reload fixes that issue, fortunately, so not too much of an issue.
Just to make this clear, this is not a PS5 Pro console problem. This is Respawn issue, not being decent with their quality control. It's absolutely shocking.
Fortunately, so not too much of an issue. But then there's image quality, and basically we're seeing all the same problems we did in performance mode, but just not as bad here. So in still shots, the PSSR grain, as we're calling it, is present here. The image is softer than it was before. Again, both going to 4K here, but it's softer than before. But in motion here, we're basically seeing a lot of the same problems as we did in the performance mode, with a lot more instability and foliage in that old quality mode. The run around the river isn't as offensive as it is in the performance mode, but it's still a lot worse than FSR. I think it's sharper, but not nearly as stable.
That's crazy.
In resolution terms, it's like the old quality mode, but actually a little bit higher on average. It's kind of hanging around 1440p or 1584p, which is pretty solid for a current generation game like this. Again, going to 4K using PSSR. So yeah, that's kind of the image quality stakes there. Performance, though, is basically perfect. It's running at a locked 30 FPS in my gameplay, except for the river, where it is dropping a couple frames. That's a more intensive area. Otherwise, it's fine. This was also basically the case in the PS5 quality mode, but in that river area, the game's frame rate dropped massively for some reason.
12.
At worst, I got like 11
PS5,
FPS. It's sort of weird because like initially it starts out at 30 FPS, and then it kind of goes down into the teens pretty quickly after a little bit, and then it kind of stays there until you get out of that area, regardless of whatever's on screen. So I don't know what's wrong here. Something is clearly not working as intended. I presume this is not intended behavior. I don't know. But maybe they're running out of memory or something, running low on memory, something like that. Maybe, because the drop is super...
I mean, you don't tend to move in the game like that, but there's still no excuse for that level of badness.
Maybe, because the drop is super hard, and it doesn't really seem to be correlated with any increase in something that's visually conspicuous on screen that would be causing the game's frame time to triple. So I don't know.
Yeah, right? it just doesn't make sense to me either. And if the PS5 Pro did have more memory and it was some sort of weird memory limitation, because we typically see ultra low frame rates on console when it looks like they're running out of memory. Like I distinctly recall Lords of the Fallen when Tom covered that, like in a number of one of its also extreme iterated patches, it was like running at like extremely like single digit frame rates or something
Xbox
like that
Series
on the series consoles at one point until they fixed it. So that was just something they maybe never fixed for the base version. But here PS5 Pro cleans it up. And looking at those res metrics, actually, I think once again, it's another, I think it makes sense kind of thing where unlike in the performance mode where it's more similar here, they can tap the dynamic res can tap into the increased GPU power here, and can run those scenes at typically higher resolutions. Not dramatically higher, but pretty high res for a current gen title that uses ray tracing, actually. So yeah, that sounds good, minus the PSSR kind of element, which because that almost feels like a downgrade at that point.
Yeah,
which isn't.
That's the thing. Like, why did I even bring it in? If it was doing okay without that. I mean, even if it was at the cost of ray tracing, keep the frame rate high and the image quality robust and stable.
Which isn't right for a patch. It should usually be better.
Yeah, I would say it's a bit of a downgrade there relative to FSR2, but I think possibly going to the nuclear option here, perhaps, we could compare it to a certain upsampling solution on PC, very famous, called DLSS, Deep Learning Super Sampling. So I did compare it briefly to the PC version with DLSS in performance mode at 1800p output, which is probably pretty close to where the console is at in terms of its typical resolution.
Okay, on them two parts there, it's not looking too different. Again, YouTube video, you can't really see it as it is properly there. But yeah, he seems very keen to compare it to the much more established DLSS. On this thing, it's third iteration now, 3.0. Like I said earlier, The first versions of DLSS were terrible. Artifacty, noisy, blurry. It was horrible. Look, far worse than what we're seeing in the first iterations of PSSR, that's for sure.
Typical resolution. I did high settings with RT on, which seemed roughly similar. Again, I'm not going to tell you that's the exact setting. I don't know, but it seems similar enough in my experience there. There's no granularity to the PC RT settings, though. It's literally an on-off toggle, which is hilarious. So I'd love to just turn off the RTGI here to make it match the PS5 Pro, but I can't. So you'll see a little bit of lighting pop in on PC. You're not going to see that on Pro. Lighting is going to look a little bit different here. I'm not going to belabor this too much because it should be pretty obvious to anyone that if it's not as good as FSR2 in this title, it should probably not be as good as DLSS, but it's a huge difference. The image is so much more stable, especially in foliage, but also in opaque geometry. You know, you're seeing less of that noise, less of that breakup, more detail there in stills. In motion, it's a huge difference as well. The image overall, very stable, very good looking, even at this more extreme upscale factor, I would say. With complex movement like these lightsaber swings here, DLSS is also doing a better job. It's much more effectively keeping that image anti-aliased, whereas PSSR tends to break up and show us a lot of those raw edges in the resolve there.
Okay.
Yeah.
The only issue is that kind of like with
Alex is like, wow, yeah. But as I said, DLSS on its 3.0 iteration now, been around a long time compared. And yeah, look at that poor shot there. How bad is that on the PC? Where's his bum gone? It's kind of got some weird shape going on there. So, and PSSR, like I say, a couple of weeks old. So, you know, this thing's pretty much brand new still. And if you want to compare apples to apples, compare the first iteration of DLSS 1.0 when it was artifacty, blurry. It was horrible.
The only issue is that kind of like with FSR2, DLSS is a little bit softer during movement. PSSR is sharper in that narrow respect.
See, so it moves nicer on the PC, and I said it's less grainy, but I say it's sharper on the PS5 Pro. I mean, looking at this image here, it is sharper on the PS5 Pro, and you know, quite often you hear PC fans saying, enjoy your console blur fest, whatever, but when it goes, you know, because they class it as blurry because PC people like native resolution more than console fans, because on a console you sit further away from the screen, so the native resolution isn't as important. Native resolution is more important to PC players because they sit very close typically to the monitor. So for that to be actually blurrier than the PS5 version there, I'm surprised he kind of washed over that as if it wasn't a thing. It's actually making it sound like it's a plus point in a way, because it has a more stable image with less of that shimmery effect going on from the PSSR. So I think if that was the other way around, they'd be pointing out how blurry the PS5 was Pro compared to the PC version, and how much clearer it was. Digital Foundry do come across slightly PC biased sometimes.
FSR2, DLSS is a little bit softer during movement. PSSR is sharper in that narrow respect during movement. You're not going to notice it too much, especially if you have motion blur, which I've turned off.
In that narrow respect, you're not going to notice it too much. It's plain as day in a YouTube video, so it would be even more obvious in real life.
Off for this video here, but basically, you know, most people are going to have motion blur when they're playing.
Sharper.
But in still shots, DLSS is resolving more detail. The last issue with DLSS possibly is...
But in still shots, DLSS was resolving more detail. In still shots, do you play the game in still shots? Digital Foundry, come on! I thought it's supposed to be an unbiased platform.
But in still shots, DLSS is resolving more detail. The last issue with DLSS possibly is that it does suffer some slightly similar issues with foliage and indirect lighting a little bit with reconstruction there, which...
See how that looks bad there on the PC compared. I'm not saying it's, you know, better on the PS5 Pro, because the PS5 Pro's version is a mess as well. They both look a bit of a mess, to be honest. But and some scenes look better on the PC, but it's clear that some scenes look better on the PS5 Pro. So it kind of swings and roundabouts. But yeah, the whole game is a bit of a mess. Like, Respawn, crikey.
Which you can kind of see in this run of the creek here. but it's a lot less prominent than with PSSR. And on the whole, the image quality, I would say, is very, very good with DLSS. Even 900p internal to 1800p output looks very, very good. But that's enough of my thoughts on it, because I have a genuine image quality expert with me.
Oh, thanks.
Alex Vidal. So what are your kind of quick impressions of DLSS here?
Well, I mean, this was one of the things that I really wanted for the game when it launched. I felt like the image quality on PC was... There was a disservice to what it could have been had the game included multiple scalars. And this was at this time when it was still not wholly common to release games with all the scalars in them, unlike where it is now, actually. So it was a great boon to image quality when it eventually was added in. And I did cover that partially in one of my update videos on this game. And I've always been pretty okay with it in this game. I know there's some frame generation issues in this game, but that is a whole other topic. In regards to how it compares to PSSR specifically here, watching your video, I feel like maybe with some of the first titles we saw where it was a lot higher res internally, especially, PSSR would acquit itself naturally better, because if the internal resolution is higher, the differences between scalars becomes actually much more proportionally smaller, and you start seeing actually macro differences in almost, I would call it, scaling style. So like the amount of aliasing or softness would be the core differentiating factors versus, you know, some other thing. The lower res you get, the amplification grows in terms of quality, stability, and all of these other things. And that's kind of what we're seeing here in your tests, specifically looking at the 1800p from what is a quarter res scale there, which is a huge scaler. Currently, it's not so surprising to me based on the things we've seen in other titles. And I think it maybe shows, one, that devs should not just blindly add PSSR to a game unless they really look at the subjective output and say this is a great win.
Agree with that. It's like Respawn here have just chucked in PSSR because they can. And it's not always necessary. It's just not. And you make something like PSSR, which is clearly good in other titles, look bad just because you're a bit of a lazy
game,
or useless developer.
Unless they really look at the subjective output and say this is a great win. Because if the current model cannot scale content from this low of a resolution and make it good, then they shouldn't add it, right? That would be the smart thing to do for players. But in this case, I almost feel like they didn't look at the output very well, because compared to DLSS is one thing, compared to FSR2, I think anyone should notice like rapidly pulsating visuals, right? Like, I don't think that is a good thing.
Honestly.
And it's almost like a health warning thing. So yeah, I feel like at the moment, PSSR probably pretty good at like 1440p and above, but at these lower resolutions, it's not in a good place, really.
Yeah, I do kind of wonder what kind of QA process produced this patch, because, I mean, in side-to-sides, or even if you're not doing a side-to-side, playing one after the other, it's so obvious. To me, it's so obvious that this is not delivering the image quality that the prior mode delivered. It's obviously not delivering image quality that would be superior to those prior modes on PS5.
Exactly. I mean, how could they not see that when developing this game? It's absolutely baffling. It really is. It's like absolute craziness, honestly. No need.
Yes, that this is not delivering the image quality that the prior mode delivered. It's obviously not delivering image quality that would be superior to those prior modes on PS5. I think this is an example of probably a couple games, maybe a few games here, where the PS5 Pro patch is not really working to my satisfaction, I would say. I think the PS5 version here is preferable. I think the PS5 version running with dynamic res on PS5 Pro, getting a bit of a boost there, would be better still. The image quality is worse almost across the board, not entirely, but worse in most respects here. On the plus side, the performance is good. The RT bump in performance mode is nice, especially in those kind of rivers and puddles, and that second level, which I tested, does look quite a bit better there. Does give you a bit more stability to that image in terms of that lighting detail. But I mean, I think that this is just not a good experience, and anyone who's booting up this game on PS5 Pro and expecting something that's going to be a really, really good visual experience, especially relative to that base console, it's not quite there. Of course, there are very many titles on PS5 Pro, which we aim to cover a good number of those titles. And many PS5 Pro patches are indeed very good. But in this case, the quality level is not 100% there.
Right.
Right, so yeah, it's not there, but it's not there due to the PS5 Pro being no good. It's due to Respawn and their quality control or complete lack of it, which is the issue, because the PS5 Pro has already shown in several other games that the Pro patch can be really good when it's done properly, and PSSR is really good when done properly. Right, so what do we make of that? Well, basically it's not really the fault of the PS5 Pro, those issues. It's more to do with Respawn and their complete lack of quality control or even any sort of thought process when it comes to putting this game together and just chucking in PSSR when clearly it's not needed or not working properly in the way it's intended because of the way that they've implemented it. It's just not a thing. And going over the PC version, Digital Foundry like to pick and choose things they show. Sometimes they showed quite kind shots there from the PC versus the PS5 Pro, possibly worst case scenarios of that shimmering effect and things like that. I've seen the PC version on a friend's PC, and it's not as bad as that PS5 Pro versions they showed there in those examples, but it's kind of somewhere in between. It was surprising to see that the PS5 Pro was actually sharper in image quality than the PC version in lots of cases as well. But it is what it is, but it's still very much a broken game. But it's not the fault of PC that's broken in the areas it's broken on there, even with DLSS still having similar issues to PSSR, just not as bad. And it's not the fault of the PS5 Pro either. It's bad implementation, bad programming by a pretty bad developer right now. Respawn managed to mess it up and still haven't got it fixed. But there's a video. If you enjoyed it, it'd be really cool if you bash that like and subscribe button. It really does help. But most of all, thanks for watching. Catch you again next time. Bye for now.